Snow fell in delicate, unbroken flakes over the quaint village of Little Havisham, coating the streets and rooftops in a thick, pristine white. The festive lights that adorned every shop front glimmered against the evening gloom, but the cheerful glow of Christmas seemed incongruous with the grim scene that awaited inside the stately Hawthorne manor. The household staff had been the first to discover the body, though discovered scarcely captured the horror of it. The young butler, trembling, had found Mr. Jonathan Hawthorne sprawled beneath the towering Christmas tree in the drawing-room, his face frozen in a mask of shock, and a single crimson smear staining the otherwise pristine snow-white carpet. No weapon lay nearby. No struggle had been evident. And yet the unmistakable certainty of death hung heavy in the room. Detective Inspector Chalmers had arrived promptly, his coat dusted with snow, though even his seasoned gaze struggled to make sense of the scene. The body had been placed deliberately, almost ceremoniously, under the tree, with one hand stretched outward as if pointing to something, but pointing to what, no one could yet say. Candles flickered on the mantel, their golden light casting long, quivering shadows, while a string of tinsel caught on a low-hanging branch, reflecting a soft, mischievous glimmer. Oddly, the gifts that had been wrapped beneath the tree remained untouched, and no footprints marred the fresh snowfall outside the drawing-room windows. Doors and windows were locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Everything seemed perfectly normal, except for the inexplicable death at the heart of the manor. When Hercule Poirot arrived, the evening had grown darker, and a hush had fallen over the household. His small, precise steps carried him into the room, his keen eyes immediately noting the peculiarities. The positioning of the body was deliberate, he observed, but the hand extended toward the small, ornate globe beneath the tree seemed almost theatrical in its precision. He bent slightly, examining the carpet around the body, noting a faint dusting of ash or soot that appeared oddly out of place, given the unlit fireplace. It was, as Poirot murmured under his breath, the little things, mes amis, the small clues that escape the careless eye. He inspected the room systematically. The windows had been locked from within, their bolts unbroken. The door, the heavy oak of which had been reinforced after a recent burglary scare, bore no marks of forced entry. Even the smallest details, a smudge on the polished wood of the piano, a faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume lingering near the mantel, caught his attention. And yet, despite his careful scrutiny, nothing offered a clear motive. No telltale signs of violence, no fingerprints out of place except perhaps those of the household staff, all of whom were well known to the victim. The puzzle seemed to Poirot almost a cruel jest. The crime presented itself as a simple, almost serene tableau, yet beneath that serene surface simmered a complexity that defied easy understanding. One detail, however, drew Poirot's particular attention. Among the carefully wrapped presents, one small, seemingly insignificant box lay slightly ajar. Within it was a single card, inscribed with elegant handwriting, "Not all is as it seems beneath the festive cheer." A note, deliberately placed, he surmised, yet it did not appear threatening. It was a riddle. The detective's mind, always alert to the subtleties of human behavior, immediately suspected that this was no ordinary crime of passion or greed. The hand that had positioned the body so meticulously beneath the tree, and the note tucked among the gifts, suggested a perpetrator who wanted attention, but whose identity remained a mystery even to those closest to the victim. Poirot's methodical gaze swept over the faces of the assembled household, the anxious matriarch, her expression taut with shock, the young maid, wringing her gloved hands, and the extended family, each member caught between grief and bewilderment. Every one of them seemed capable, yet none bore the appearance of overt malice. The detective's little grey cells stirred with quiet intensity, recognizing that the key lay not in force or rashness, but in subtlety and observation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling all sound, creating an almost eerie sense of suspended time, as if the world itself held its breath. Here, Poirot understood, was a crime that would challenge his very intellect. It appeared simple, an unexpected death beneath the Christmas tree. But the simplicity was deceptive. There were no eyewitnesses, no apparent motive, and no weapon. And yet, the deliberate positioning of the body, the cryptic note, and the small, strange details scattered throughout the room hinted at a mind at work, careful, calculating, and precise. Poirot's gaze returned once more to the extended hand, hovering near the ornate globe, and he felt the faintest thrill of anticipation. Somewhere within this meticulously arranged scene lay the truth, waiting to be teased out. It would not reveal itself easily, but for Hercule Poirot that was the very essence of a mystery worth solving. As the detective stepped back and let his eyes sweep the room one last time, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The crime, he realized, had been designed to baffle, to confound, to appear unsolvable. Yet, as always, there existed a method beneath the madness, a reason behind the riddle. Poirot's hands, clasped behind his back, itched not for violence or confrontation, but for the patient unraveling of truth. And so, beneath the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, amidst the stillness of falling snow and the tension of a household in shock, the game began in earnest, with Hercule Poirot poised to uncover the secrets that lay hidden in plain sight. Poirot lingered near the tree, his eyes sweeping the drawing-room with meticulous care, noting the placement of every ornament, the slight skew of a framed painting on the wall, the faint discoloration of the carpet where it seemed a chair had once rested. While Inspector Chalmers busied himself with cataloguing evidence, questioning the nervous staff in hurried tones, Poirot's gaze fell upon a detail that seemed trivial to everyone else, a silver bell, slightly tarnished, lying under the sofa. It did not belong there. Its chain was broken, and a tiny scratch marred its polished surface. A careless observer might have passed it over, but to Poirot it spoke volumes. Someone had been in this room recently, and in haste, or perhaps in anxiety, had displaced this object. He crouched, examining it with the precision of a surgeon. The bell was small, intended perhaps for a servant to signal the master, yet its presence beneath the sofa suggested more than accidental neglect. Poirot's little grey cells immediately began to turn. A bell could be used for signalling, for distraction, even for misdirection. The way it lay hidden yet within reach implied that someone had intended to conceal a sound or a message, and in the flurry of events had failed. It was a subtle clue, but Poirot knew that in mysteries, subtlety often held the key. Turning his attention to the assembled household, he noticed Mrs. Hawthorne, the widow, standing near the mantel with a trembling hand pressed against her chest. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted occasionally toward the door, as if expecting someone else to appear. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, and he observed the faintest tightening of her lips, the slight tremor of her fingers, not from grief alone, but from something else, perhaps guilt or apprehension. He made a mental note. Emotion, when forced to mask a deeper truth, often betrays itself in the smallest gestures. As Chalmers moved to examine the fireplace, noting its lack of recent use, Poirot's attention shifted to a small scrap of paper, almost invisible against the rug near the hearth. Picking it up carefully, he read the elegant looping script, a fragment of a list, words cut off mid-sentence. It seemed innocuous, yet the placement was deliberate. It had not simply fallen there. Someone had handled it recently, and the cut edge suggested haste. Poirot turned the paper over, noting a faint smudge of ink that could only have come from human handling within the past hours. Here, he realized, was the first sign of deception, something placed to appear accidental, to divert attention. He observed the staff more closely. The young maid, Sophie, kept wringing her hands, her gaze shifting nervously between the detective and the fireplace. Poirot noticed the faint scent of lavender clinging to her gloves, incongruous with the faint smokiness in the room. He filed it away in his mind, recognizing it as a detail that might seem irrelevant now but could later illuminate motive or opportunity. The butler, in contrast, spoke in measured tones, yet Poirot caught the occasional hesitation in his speech, the tiny flicker of an eye that betrayed more than words conveyed. Each reaction, each nuance of body language, added a stroke to the invisible portrait of the perpetrator. Poirot then returned to the tree itself, crouching slightly to examine the gifts beneath. He ran his fingers over the wrapping paper, noting fingerprints smudged in places where they should not have been, the faint trace of a foreign scent, rosewood, mingled with a subtle, acrid undertone. His mind pieced together the possibilities. Someone had handled the gifts, perhaps to insert or remove something, or to mislead investigators. The hand stretched toward the ornate globe suddenly assumed a new significance. It was not merely a pose, he realized, but a signal, a deliberate pointer to a message hidden in plain sight. Moving around the room with a careful step, Poirot's attention was drawn to the windowsill, where a single, snow-dusted footprint marred the otherwise untouched ledge. It was small, almost childlike, yet the shape was precise. Someone had been here, outside or inside, and had left a trace that contradicted the apparent perfection of the crime scene. Poirot felt a thrill of anticipation. This footprint, the misplaced bell, the fragment of paper, and the subtle reactions of the household were all pieces of a puzzle, seemingly disconnected, yet slowly converging toward a hidden logic. He straightened, his gaze sweeping the room one final time before stepping back. Inspector Chalmers, frustrated by the lack of obvious leads, murmured about the impossibility of the case. Poirot, however, smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly to himself. He had already begun to discern patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. The crime was not random, it was carefully orchestrated. The first threads of deception had revealed themselves, but the full tapestry remained concealed, somewhere within this house, amidst the gleaming ornament. Ments, carefully wrapped gifts, and trembling witnesses lay the truth. And Poirot, with his unparalleled powers of observation and deduction, would unravel it, thread by thread, until the hidden hand behind this holiday tragedy was exposed. Poirot invited the household members to the drawing-room, asking them to speak freely about the events leading up to the shocking discovery. One by one, they recounted their stories. Yet each version contained subtle discrepancies that only a mind trained to detect nuance could perceive. Mrs. Hawthorne began, her voice quivering, describing how she had retired early to her room, having left her husband in the drawing-room admiring the tree. She insisted she had heard nothing unusual until the butler came to fetch her. Her story was calm, almost rehearsed, yet Poirot noticed the slightest hesitation when she mentioned the time of her retirement, as if she were calculating her words to fit a narrative. The butler, James, spoke next. He claimed he had been in the kitchen arranging the final course of the Christmas dinner when he heard a muffled thump. He rushed toward the drawing-room, he said, and found Mr. Hawthorne lying beneath the tree. His account, while plausible on the surface, contained tiny inconsistencies. He described locking the pantry door earlier that evening, yet Poirot had already noted that the pantry key had been found on the floor near the fireplace. Such a small detail might escape the attention of ordinary observers, but to Poirot it hinted at either forgetfulness or deliberate misdirection. Sophie, the young maid, was visibly distraught. She stammered as she tried to recount her movements, claiming she had been dusting the library shelves when she heard the commotion. Her eyes darted repeatedly to the window, to the tree, to her fellow servants, and Poirot caught the subtle signs of nervous calculation in her gestures. She was eager to demonstrate her innocence, yet that eagerness only heightened his suspicion. One does not strive so diligently to prove a lack of involvement unless one fears implication. Poirot filed the detail away, suspecting that fear, or perhaps shame, might be motivating her words. The extended family members each added their own recollections, though their testimonies were curiously uniform in tone, almost as if rehearsed. Mr. Hawthorne's cousin, Edward, claimed he had been in the study composing a letter to a distant business partner. He stated he had seen nothing out of the ordinary, yet Poirot observed his eyes flicker toward the tree when he spoke. The subtle movement, almost imperceptible, betrayed more than his carefully chosen words. Each witness, while superficially cooperative, revealed tiny cracks in their accounts, contradictions in timing, in sequence, in the smallest gestures. Poirot's keen perception told him that somewhere beneath the surface, deception festered. He questioned the staff about their interactions with Mr. Hawthorne earlier in the day. James insisted that the master had been in excellent spirits, remarking on the beauty of the tree and the gifts beneath it. Yet Sophie contradicted him, claiming she had noticed her employer tense after a private phone call. Poirot's sharp eyes caught the subtle but telling discrepancy. James's posture stiffened as he repeated his account, his hands clasping the edge of a chair, while Sophie's face paled, her lips pressed tightly together. Both were telling truths shaped by personal perspective, yet both were also carefully concealing details that could reveal motive or opportunity. Poirot asked gently about any recent disputes or tensions within the household. Mrs. Hawthorne seemed flustered at the question, her gaze shifting rapidly. Edward's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Sophie hesitated. Anne muttered that minor disagreements had arisen over household duties. It was nothing serious, she insisted, yet Poirot detected the subtext. Minor grievances often mask deeper resentments, and resentment can fester into fatal consequences. Even in a tranquil household, human passions can ignite unpredictably, particularly when layered with pride, inheritance, or secrecy. Poirot's attention then returned to the note discovered beneath the gifts. He inquired if anyone had noticed it before the body was found. Silence followed. Eyes averted, breath held, small movements betrayed anxiety. One detail emerged. Edward admitted that he had handled the presents earlier in the evening, ostensibly arranging them for aesthetic effect. The admission seemed innocent, yet Poirot noted the faint trace of ink on Edward's fingers, a detail consistent with the scrap of paper found by the fireplace. The faint smudge suggested opportunity, yet whether it signaled guilt or mere proximity was yet to be discerned. As the questioning continued, Poirot felt the atmosphere in the room thicken. Each witness, eager to protect themselves or the household's reputation, wove a careful web of words, yet in doing so, they left threads exposed for those trained to see. Subtle contradictions, fleeting gestures, half-truths and omissions, all these combined to form a tapestry of hidden motives, a network of potential deception that no ordinary inspector could unravel without extraordinary attention to detail. Poirot, however, sensed that the puzzle was beginning to clarify. Among these veiled expressions and careful narratives, one thread would ultimately reveal the hand behind the carefully staged crime beneath the Christmas tree. Poirot retired to a quiet corner of the drawing-room, motioning for Inspector Chalmers to join him, and began to consider the web of motives that now stretched before him like an intricate tapestry. Each member of the household, each servant and relative, appeared to have reason, some overt, some subtle, for wishing harm to Mr. Hawthorne, yet none seemed capable of executing such a precisely orchestrated act without leaving more obvious traces. It was the complexity of human desire, he reflected, that made murder a delicate art. Greed, jealousy, fear, and revenge all conspired, each adding its own layer of confusion to the puzzle. He started with Edward, the cousin who had admitted handling the gifts. Edward's inheritance depended on the terms of Mr. Hawthorne's will, and yet he had protested only half-heartedly at being overlooked for certain family business ventures. Greed, perhaps restrained by propriety, could become a motive if opportunity presented itself. Poirot noted Edward's faint smudge of ink, which could suggest tampering with the note, but he needed more than circumstantial evidence. Was Edward bold enough to act alone, or merely a participant in a larger plan? The detective's mind ticked through the possibilities. Mrs. Hawthorne, meanwhile, presented a subtler, but no less potent potential motive. Though outwardly grieving, Poirot had noticed the faint tension in her jaw and the careful phrasing of her words. A long-standing disagreement over family finances had created friction between her and her husband. Her appearance of composure masked something deeper, perhaps resentment long buried beneath the veneer of domestic tranquility. Poirot did not yet believe she acted directly, but he suspected that, like Edward, she possessed emotional leverage that could influence events behind the scenes. Then there was Sophie, the young maid, whose fear and eagerness to prove innocence had revealed contradictions in her statements. Her position within the household afforded both opportunity and knowledge. She had access to every room, stood the daily rhythms and knew precisely how to avoid suspicion. And yet, Poirot considered her youth and apparent naivety. Could she truly orchestrate such a methodical crime, or was she an instrument in someone else's scheme? Her nervous gestures suggested hidden pressure and perhaps complicity, though of what kind remained unclear. James, the butler, appeared the most outwardly reliable, his account precise and measured. Yet even he was not immune to subtle motives. The management of a household such as Hawthorne Manor involves the delicate navigation of influence and loyalty. and small resentments can fester into significant consequences. Poirot considered the possibility that James's strict adherence to protocol masked more than professionalism. It could conceal resentment, fear of the master's temper, or secret alliances with another household member. Even the most outwardly disciplined servant could be caught in the tangle of human desire that now enfolded the manor. Poirot's attention turned to the seemingly minor details: the misplaced bell, the scrap of paper, the faint trace of rosewood on the wrapping paper, the small footprint by the window. Each of these, when considered in isolation, might appear trivial, yet together they suggested subtle interference, small actions that could only be performed by someone intimately familiar with the household's routines. The detective realized that motive alone did not identify the criminal. It merely pointed toward opportunity, intent, and the pressures shaping each person's behavior. He began to map the relationships in his mind. Edward's ambition intersected with Mrs. Hawthorne's resentment. Sophie's vulnerability overlapped with James's disciplined oversight. Conflicting loyalties, hidden frustrations, and unspoken alliances created a maze in which the truth lay buried. Each suspect had a reason to act, yet no sin. G.L.E. explanation accounted for the meticulous staging of the body beneath the Christmas tree, the carefully placed note, or the delicate manipulation of the scene to obscure the path of discovery. The crime was not born of passion alone, nor of greed in isolation. It was a symphony of motivations, a deliberate layering of human complexity to confound observation. Poirot stood, pacing slowly, his eyes scanning the room and resting on the tableau beneath the tree. He envisioned each suspect moving through the manor that evening, their choices and constraints, their ambitions and fears shaping every step. The threads of motive, tangled as they were, began to suggest patterns, faint outlines of a plan concealed by the apparent chaos. The detective's mind worked like a watchmaker, aligning the gears of human behavior, noting the friction points and intersections. Somewhere within the intersecting desires, resentments, and ambitions lay the invisible hand responsible for this holiday tragedy. As he paused, his gaze returned to the extended hand of the body, pointing toward the ornate globe beneath the tree. It was a signpost, subtle and deliberate, indicating that the solution required more than observation. It required deduction, patience, and a keen understanding of the human heart. Poirot understood now that the path to discovery lay not in rushing toward accusation, but in unraveling the motives, tracing the interplay of desire and opportunity until the web of deception revealed its architect. And in that quiet moment, beneath the flickering glow of Christmas lights, he felt the first real stirrings of certainty. The crime could be understood, if one followed the logic hidden within the maze of human intention. Poirot lingered in the drawing-room long after the household had been questioned, observing the interplay of shadows cast by the flickering Christmas lights. His tell grey cells were alight with the myriad motives, the subtle gestures, the inconsistencies in speech, but nothing yet pointed definitively to the culprit. That evening, as the snow continued to fall softly outside, a sudden commotion broke the contemplative quiet. Inspector Chalmers had returned, holding a folded sheet of paper and a small, delicate object in his gloved hand. "Poirot," he said with an almost triumphant tone, "we may have a breakthrough." He laid the items on the table with a flourish. The paper was a ledger, partially burned at the edges, detailing financial transactions, and the object was a small, ornate ring, unmistakably engraved with the initials. A. Chalmers' eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of a detective who believed the path had cleared. According to his interpretation, Edward had been embezzling funds from Mr. Hawthorne's business accounts. The ring, they claimed, was a token left in haste, dropped during a confrontation. In the inspector's mind, motive and opportunity now aligned neatly, and the case appeared, at first glance, resolved. The household was quickly summoned, and Edward looked pale and uncertain under the weight of attention. Poirot watched closely, noting every twitch, every slight change in expression. The narrative seemed airtight. Edward had financial motive. The ring tied him to the scene, and the ledger suggested illicit dealings. A gasp went through the assembled family as Chalmers spoke of Edward's supposed guilt. Edward's protests, while measured, seemed almost too careful, almost rehearsed. He admitted to minor discrepancies in the accounts, but vehemently denied any involvement in the death itself. Poirot, however, felt a subtle unease. Something about the sudden clarity of the situation, the neatly packaged solution, seemed artificially tidy. The bell beneath the sofa, the scrap of paper near the hearth, the faint scent of rosewood, all the details he had noticed earlier, still existed, yet no one had accounted for them. The staged positioning of the body, the carefully placed note under the tree, and the faint footprint by the window did not fit Edward's apparent clumsiness. A mind capable of embezzlement might be shrewd with finances, but Poirot suspected that a clever criminal would not leave such a meticulously crafted tableau to chance. He studied Edward more closely, noticing the subtle micro-expressions, the brief flash of irritation when he was interrupted, the slight twitch of the fingers as he touched the ledger. These were not signs of panic alone, but signs of someone caught between truth and deception. Poirot's instincts told him that Edward might indeed have a role, perhaps peripheral, but he was not the mastermind who had orchestrated the evening's grim spectacle. Poirot's gaze shifted to the other household members as the inspector pressed Edward for confession. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression hardened for an instant, before softening again. Sophie's hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white, and even James, the butler, seemed to watch the proceedings with a subtle tension that did not match his normally measured demeanor. All these reactions hinted at knowledge or complicity, hidden or partial, and they confirmed Poirot's suspicions. The crime was more intricate than the authorities imagined. While the household remained focused on Edward, Poirot returned his attention to the scene itself, the hand pointing to the globe beneath the tree, the note tucked among the gifts, and the carefully arranged ornaments all suggested a mind at work that delighted in misdirection. The false clarity of Edward's confession served perfectly to distract attention from the real architect of the crime. Poirot understood that the murderer had anticipated the natural eagerness of the authorities to close the case, creating a scenario in which the wrong person would appear guilty. As the family's murmurs filled the room, and Chalmers prepared to formally close the investigation, Poirot remained impassive, almost imperceptibly shaking his head. He had learned, through years of observing human cunning, that the first solution often masks a deeper, more carefully concealed truth. The true criminal, he realized, had allowed a shadow to fall over the scene, manipulating events so that suspicion fell precisely where it was intended. Yet the threads of deception were faintly imperfect, detectable to one with a trained eye. Poirot's mind, alive with subtle observations and deductions, knew the game was far from over. The snow continued to drift against the windows, muffling the world outside, while inside the manor the false victory hung heavily in the air. The household believed the danger had passed, and Edward faced temporary disgrace, but Poirot's gaze lingered on the tableau beneath the tree. Somewhere in the shadows the real criminal waited, poised, confident and patient, certain that their clever ruse had succeeded, for now. And Hercule Poirot, with his unwavering attention to detail and his unmatched capacity for logical insight, knew that the final act of this Christmas tragedy had yet to be played. Poirot remained in the drawing-room long after the household had dispersed for the evening, his eyes scanning the scene beneath the Christmas tree as if the ornaments themselves held secrets. The snow outside continued its silent descent, and the flickering firelight cast long, wavering shadows across the room. Edward had been temporarily relieved of suspicion by his partial confession to Financy. Irregularities, and yet Poirot's instincts whispered that the heart of the crime lay elsewhere, woven into strands invisible to all but the most attentive observer. He returned to the scrap of paper found near the hearth, turning it over delicately in his fingers, noting again the partial words, the smudged ink, and the deliberate imperfection of the cut. The note was not merely a red herring, it was a message designed to mislead, yet it hinted at a knowledge of history, of shared experience, perhaps even of grudges long buried. Poirot's thoughts drifted back to an old case he had investigated nearly 15 years prior, a quiet scandal involving a wealthy family in a neighboring county. There had been a dispute over inheritance, clandestine relationships, and a carefully hidden deception that had allowed a criminal to evade suspicion for months. The names were different, yet the patterns bore a striking resemblance. Poirot's mind, always alert to repetition and human nature, perceived a faint echo of that case here. He recalled a young governess, dismissed under suspicious circumstances, and a scandalous note that had been thought lost. Could it be that some grievance, buried in the past, had resurfaced to poison the present? As he examined the faces of the household again, Poirot began to connect subtle dots that had previously seemed unrelated. Mrs. Hawthorne's tension, Sophie's anxious gestures, Edward's financial preoccupations, and even James's unwavering attention to protocol all seemed to intersect along lines that were not purely coincidental. Poirot considered their histories, long-standing relationships, past slights, and minor disputes that had never fully resolved. The hidden web of human interactions extended backward in time, invisible to those focused only on the immediate circumstances of the crime. It was in these interconnections, he realized, that the true motive might lie. The key, Poirot sensed, was a memory shared by the household members, a secret overlooked because it had seemed irrelevant. He recalled a conversation with Mrs. Hawthorne's late aunt years before, which had hinted at a quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface of the family's apparent harmony. The tension had never erupted openly, but the embers had remained, fed by minor injustices and the careful concealment of truth. Poirot's keen eyes now searched for traces of that hidden discord, a photograph misaligned on the mantel, a folded letter partially hidden beneath the piano, the faint scent of a perfume he remembered from another era. He approached the globe beneath the tree, noting again the hand that had been positioned to point toward it. The globe itself, with its intricate engravings and delicate craftsmanship, held no immediate clue, but its significance was symbolic. Poirot considered that the murderer had deliberately chosen an object of heritage and continuity, linking the present crime to long-standing familial or social history. Someone intended to remind the household, perhaps subconsciously, that the past had not been forgotten, that old grievances still demanded acknowledgement. Poirot then asked himself why Edward's temporary scapegoating had been orchestrated so perfectly. Could it be that the real criminal sought to hide behind the familiar framework of family tension? The connections between suspects were not merely circumstantial. They had roots in shared history, in old resentments, in forgotten alliances and betrayals. Even Sophie's nervousness took on new meaning. She was not only frightened of immediate consequences, but also aware of secrets that predated her employment, remnants of disputes and misunderstandings that had lingered in the shadows. As he pieced the threads together, Poirot understood that the crime was not a sudden eruption of passion or opportunity, but a carefully considered act, informed by knowledge of human nature and of the subtle, enduring power of the past. Every gesture, every placement of objects, every cryptic note was part of a design to draw the present back into alignment with unresolved matters from years before. The murderer had studied the household, its routines and its histories, and used that knowledge to orchestrate a tableau of seeming simplicity that concealed the complexity beneath. Standing in the quiet glow of the firelight, Poirot allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The truth, he realized, would emerge only when the connections between past and present were fully understood. The overlooked details, the faint traces of memory, and the subtle interactions among the household members were all pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle, now revived with deadly precision. Somewhere among them, a figure moved with calm calculation, confident in their concealment, yet blind to the fact that Poirot had already begun to trace the faint lines linking motive, opportunity, and history. The shadows of the past were no longer invisible. They were poised to illuminate the path to the murderer. Poirot stood once more in the drawing-room, the firelight flickering across his sharp, thoughtful features. The household had retired for the evening, yet the room still carried the echoes of the day's chaos, the faint scent of perfume lingering near the mantel, the slightly tilted ornaments on the tree, and the small scrap of paper that had captured his attention hours before. He realized that, to unearth the truth, he would need to employ a method beyond mere observation and questioning. A subtler, more unconventional tactic would be required, one that probed the mind rather than the immediate evidence. He summoned Sophie, the young maid, under the pretense of requiring her assistance to rearrange some of the gifts beneath the tree. As she hesitated near the drawing-room door, Poirot's eyes met hers with a quiet intensity, noting her reluctance, the slight flush on her cheeks, and the way her hands twisted the edge of her apron. "Sophie," he said gently, "you have been helpful this evening. I require your keen judgment. Tell me, where would you place the presents if you wish them to appear undisturbed yet also draw attention?" He gestured to the tree in the surrounding area, speaking as if discussing a simple matter of decor. The young girl's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced briefly toward the window, then down at the floor. Poirot observed her every motion. Her instinctive glance suggested an awareness of something hidden, an unspoken secret connected to the positioning of the objects. I would arrange them neatly," she stammered, "but perhaps leave a small noticeable item, just enough to catch attention." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Her words were casual, yet they mirrored the meticulous placement of the body and the note beneath the tree. She was unwittingly describing the crime scene. Poirot allowed her to continue speaking, weaving her words into his mental reconstruction. He then introduced a small psychological test, speaking as if considering a trivial matter of holiday mischief. "Suppose," he said softly, "one wished to create a puzzle, something for others to notice, but without revealing one's intent. How might one achieve this?" He observed Sophie carefully, noting the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the hesitation before her response. "By arranging items so that the eye is drawn to them." "But not the mind," she replied almost instinctively, her voice a whisper. Poirot smiled inwardly. She had, without realizing it, described the criminal's method, distraction, misdirection, and control over attention. Next, he invited Edward to join, feigning curiosity about the arrangement of gifts and the odd placement of ornaments. "Edward," Poirot said, "I find these objects most intriguing. Do you think anyone could have moved them deliberately, perhaps to suggest a story that did not occur?" The question, framed as innocent speculation, acted as a subtle trap. Poirot watched Edward's micro-expressions, the way his hand twitched against his coat, the momentary narrowing of his eyes, the faint reddening at the temples. He hesitated before answering, carefully choosing words that sounded reasonable yet were measured to conceal agitation. Poirot pressed further, speaking casually of the note under the tree. "A most curious card, n'est-ce pas? If one wished to convey a message without speaking it aloud, could one not leave a written word in a particular place?" Edward swallowed, his gaze flickering toward the hearth. His reaction, almost imperceptible, betrayed a flash. H of recognition. A subtle crack in the veneer of composure he had maintained throughout the investigation. He claimed, smoothly, that he had not considered it, yet Poirot had already noted the faint smudge of ink on his fingers and the earlier admission of handling the gifts. The detective's psychological gambit had exposed tension previously masked by polite denials. Poirot's attention then shifted to Mrs. Hawthorne. In casual conversation he remarked on the subtle scents in the room, the faint traces of perfume, the unusual placement of a bell near the sofa. He observed the micro-reactions, her quick inhalation, the slight stiffening of her posture, the imperceptible tightening of her lips. These were not random gestures, they indicated awareness, familiarity, and perhaps guilt by association. Poirot knew that the criminal's identity could be teased out by these tiny signals, which revealed knowledge of the scene that only the perpetrator, or an accomplice, would possess. By the evening's end, Poirot had gathered far more than testimony. He had, through careful use of suggestion, observation, and psychological nuance, exposed the subtle cracks in the facades of the household. Fear, recognition, and instinctive reactions had betrayed truths that even the suspects themselves sought to hide. The unconventional tactic had worked. In the quiet, intimate testing of perception and response, the detective had begun to see the outlines of the real criminal, hidden behind a mask of composure, patience, and meticulous misdirection. Standing alone near the tree, Poirot allowed his gaze to linger on the hand of the lifeless body, still pointing toward the globe. The room seemed to whisper its secrets, each object and gesture resonating with meaning. The unconventional clue, the psychological insight gained from subtle reactions, had illuminated the path forward. He understood now that the criminal, confident in their careful orchestration, had underestimated the perceptiveness of a mind attuned to the smallest tremor, the briefest hesitation. The shadow that had eluded the authorities was no longer invisible. Poirot's little grey cells were already piecing together the final steps toward revelation. The next morning, Poirot arrived at Hawthorne Manor while the household was still stirring, determined to follow the leads he had teased out the previous evening. The drawing-room, bathed in the pale light of a winter dawn, seemed calm, almost serene. Yet Poirot's instincts told him that beneath this outward tranquillity, the pulse of danger still beat. He moved first to the hearth, where the scrap of paper had been found, his gloved fingers brushing the carpet with meticulous care. The note, which had provided the first hints of subtle misdirection, was gone, completely vanished. Poirot froze, the small hairs on the back of his neck rising. "Impossible," he murmured, bending to inspect the area. The carpet bore no sign of disturbance, no indication that it had been moved or tampered with, and yet the evidence had disappeared. Deliberately, he was certain. Someone had entered the room under cover of darkness, removed the fragment, and thereby attempted to erase a critical clue. His eyes swept the rest of the room. The bell remained under the sofa, the globe still glittered beneath the tree, but the delicate web of physical evidence that had allowed his deductions to begin unravelling was compromised. Poirot called Inspector Chalmers quietly to his side. "Observe, mon ami, how the criminal acts. They are clever, they understand the value of what we see and do not see. This disappearance is intentional. It is a warning. Proceed too quickly, and the truth will be buried forever." Chalmers frowned, muttering about fingerprints and footprints, but Poirot waved him to silence. He already knew the thief had been careful, leaving no trace, no telltale sign. Only a mind attuned to human cunning could anticipate such precision. He questioned the household, ostensibly about the note. Sophie appeared genuinely puzzled, wringing her hands, insisting she had seen nothing. Mrs. Hawthorne, composed but with a slight tremor in her fingers, claimed to have retired early and noticed nothing unusual, while Edward, calm yet slightly pale, denied leaving his room that morning. Poirot listened intently, catching the almost imperceptible flinch each suspect displayed when the note was mentioned. He realized that the removal of the evidence was not merely to obstruct the investigation, it was also a psychological maneuver designed to instill confusion and doubt. Poirot's thoughts turned immediately to motive. Who among the household had the knowledge, the daring, and the cunning to remove the note without detection? It could not have been a random act. The thief understood both the importance of the clue and the subtleties of timing, arriving when the household was asleep, acting with precision, and vanishing without. Trace. Each potential suspect, Poirot reasoned, now became both a participant in the investigation and a possible saboteur of it. Trust, he noted, was now a fragile commodity. He inspected the room again, noting faint scuff marks near the fireplace that could have been made by a gloved hand moving the hearthrug. The marks were subtle, almost invisible, yet they suggested movement and the careful handling of the carpet. Poirot's mind traced the possibilities. One could lift the paper with a finger, an implement, or even the edge of the rug. A person of small stature could slip in and out unnoticed. It was a reminder that opportunity was as critical as motive, and that the criminal's understanding of the manor's layout had been thorough. As he walked slowly around the tree, Poirot considered the wider implications. The disappearance of the note not only delayed progress, it signaled that the perpetrator was still active, still observing, and still confident that the authorities were not fully aware of the stakes. The criminal was not simply hiding, they were controlling the narrative, shaping suspicion and testing the vigilance of those who sought the truth. The lesson was clear. The investigation had entered a more dangerous phase, where errors could mislead and overconfidence could be fatal. Poirot paused, his gaze returning to the space where the note had been. Though the physical clue had vanished, the information it had conveyed lingered in his mind. The pattern of placement, the implied message, and the subtle indicators of human behavior it had revealed. The vanishing of evidence, he realized, was not a dead end but an invitation to observe more closely, to read between the lines of words and actions, and to consider the invisible threads that connected past grievances to present treachery. Someone in the household was working diligently to manipulate events, yet even in this deliberate interference, Poirot perceived a trace of the criminal's mind, an unconscious slip that would guide him closer to revelation. With the room silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire, Poirot straightened, his eyes sharp, his expression calm but unyielding. The stakes had risen, the path forward complicated, and the criminal had shown both courage and cunning. Yet in the disappearance of the note lay not only a challenge but also a promise. Those who underestimate the meticulous powers of Hercule Poirot, he thought, risk revealing themselves in the very act of concealment. And somewhere in the manor, the hidden hand responsible for this holiday murder was watching, waiting, and believing that the game was still theirs to control. The morning's fragile calm had barely settled over Hawthorne Manor when a shrill scream shattered the silence. Poirot, alerted by a hurried summons, arrived in the library, where the household had gathered in alarm. Mrs. Hawthorne stood pale and trembling near the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Sophie's eyes were wide with shock. In the center of the room lay Edward, sprawled across the oriental rug, his face contorted in pain, and a single precise wound marked the fatal entry of a dagger. The scene was immediate, violent, and incomprehensible. A second, deliberate act of murder that threw the investigation into sudden chaos. Poirot knelt beside Edward's body, noting with clinical detachment the angle of the wound and the lack of defensive bruising. The attack had been swift, calculated, and unmistakably intended to prevent further testimony or confession. His eyes flicked to the surrounding room. The windows were still closed and locked from the inside, the heavy curtains drawn against the winter light. The murder had occurred. In a space assumed to be safe, a room filled with witnesses who had been present just moments before, and yet no one had seen the act. The killer had mastered the art of timing and concealment. Inspector Chalmers arrived in a flurry, flustered and muttering about the impossibility of the crime. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind already racing through possibilities. He examined the dagger, noting the faint trace of a fingerprint near the hilt, partially smudged as if intentionally obscured. The weapon itself had been taken from the manor's display collection, yet it bore evidence of recent handling that did not match any of the known occupant's prints precisely. This was a criminal who anticipated investigation, someone who moved with both intelligence and audacity. Poirot questioned the household immediately, seeking even the smallest clue. Sophie insisted she had been tidying bookshelves, and Mrs. Hawthorne claimed she had been fetching tea in the kitchen. But Poirot's eyes caught the subtle discrepancies, a faint trace of ash on Sophie's gloves that did not belong to the library, and the faintest blush of irritation on Mrs. Hawthorne's cheeks, a sign of emotion carefully concealed. Even James, the butler, had a slight tremor in his hands as he recounted his movements, a telltale sign of anxiety. The killer had orchestrated the murder with precision, yet human instinct had left cracks, however small, that Poirot could already detect. As he reconstructed the sequence of events, Poirot considered the implications. The second murder was not random, it was a calculated escalation. Edward's death served multiple purposes: to silence a potential witness, to mislead suspicion, and to test the detective's resolve. The criminal was demonstrating both skill and audacity, making clear that the investigation would not proceed unchecked. Poirot realized the killer was Sèvres. Raoul steps ahead, yet, in their confidence, they had underestimated the depth of observation that could pierce even the most carefully constructed deception. Poirot's gaze returned to the first crime scene in the drawing-room, now seen through the lens of this new act of violence. The staged positioning of Mr. Hawthorne beneath the tree, the cryptic note, the vanished paper, all of it was part of a larger design. The murderer had anticipated the authorities' eagerness for a simple solution, had set traps to misdirect, and had now escalated to a level that demanded urgent vigilance. Poirot recognized the psychological sophistication of the criminal, the creation of fear, the manipulation of trust, the orchestration of suspense. Each act was intended to destabilize, to bend the investigation to the killer's control. He examined the library's layout, noting the shadowed corners, the heavy drapery, the furniture that could conceal movement. Poirot understood that the criminal had chosen this room for its strategic advantages: proximity to witnesses, yet ample cover for sudden action. The audacity of striking in full view of the household was not carelessness, it was a display of power intended to unnerve and assert dominance. Poirot stepped back, closing his eyes briefly to let the events coalesce in his mind. The investigation was no longer simply about reconstructing past actions, it had become a race against time to prevent further tragedy. The killer's next move was unpredictable, yet not without pattern. By analyzing opportunity, motive, and the subtle traces of human behavior left in the aftermath, Poirot sensed that the final confrontation was approaching. The criminal's confidence might be formidable, but Poirot's observation, deduction, and understanding of the human heart were sharper still. Somewhere in the manor, hidden in plain sight, the mastermind waited, unawed. That the net was beginning to tighten. Poirot sat quietly in the drawing-room, the morning sunlight spilling across the scattered remnants of the previous night's chaos. The second murder had left the household shaken, every member on edge, yet the detective's mind was calm, deliberate as always. While the authorities scrambled to secure the scene and interview witnesses anew, Poirot's attention returned to the minutiae, the small, overlooked details that often carried more truth than words ever could. It was in these nuances, he reflected, that the murderer had left traces of their method and motive, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. His gaze settled on the ornaments of the Christmas tree, each meticulously placed. One, a delicate glass bell, appeared slightly lower than the others, as though it had been repositioned by hand. He remembered the bell found beneath the sofa, now returned to its proper place after being catalogued by the authorities. It was a minor object, almost trivial in appearance, yet Poirot's mind raced. The bell had been moved, yes, but by whom, and for what purpose? The pattern, he realized, was not in the grand gestures of the crime, but in these tiny shifts of objects, subtle indicators of human movement and intention. Poirot's attention then returned to Sophie, whose nervous glances had betrayed more than she could articulate. He recalled her comment about arranging gifts so that attention might be drawn subtly, words that had seemed casual, even innocent, the previous evening. Yet now, in the context of the second murder, they took on new significance. The murderer had relied on misdirection, guiding observers' attention while manipulating the environment. Sophie's description had unintentionally mirrored the criminal's methodology, distraction, placement, and concealment, all orchestrated to mislead the eye. He rose and moved to the fire. Replace, crouching to examine the hearth-rug once more. The faint scuff marks he had noticed before now suggested a rhythm of movement. Someone had consistently approached the same area, retrieving or replacing objects with deliberate intent. Poirot's eyes flicked to the faint residue of rosewood on the floorboards, the delicate trace of scent he had observed near the gifts. The pattern was becoming clear. The murderer had followed a specific path through the manor, leaving clues designed to draw attention in one direction, while masking the true action elsewhere. His thoughts turned to Edward, whose partial confession had seemed so convenient. The ledger, the ring, the fabricated story of embezzlement, they had all served as a red herring. Poirot now saw how the initial false victory had been orchestrated to obscure the real sequence of events. The real perpetrator had anticipated human assumptions that a visible motive or obvious clue must indicate guilt. In reality, the answer had lain hidden, obscured by misdirection and waiting for the detective perceptive enough to notice the rhythm beneath the chaos. Poirot's gaze fell to a faint indentation in the carpet near the library doorway, a subtle mark previously dismissed as accidental. It was the perfect height for a hand to push something aside or retrieve a small object. The thought struck him suddenly, with the clarity of lightning. The same pattern had repeated at each critical point. The misplaced bell, the scrap of paper, the dagger in the library. Each instance of randomness was deliberate, a signature left by the criminal's meticulous planning. The pieces that had seemed disconnected were in fact aligned along a carefully considered trajectory of human movement and timing. The detective's eyes swept over the household members gathered uneasily at a distance. Every glance, every nervous gesture, every micro-X. Expression now took on new meaning. Poirot realized that the killer's confidence had been their undoing. They'd left subtle imprints of method, expecting that no one would perceive them amid the chaos. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. The orchestrated placement of objects, the psychological manipulation of the witnesses, and the repeated use of misdirection all pointed to the same mind. As he straightened, Poirot allowed a faint smile to cross his face. The solution had been hiding in plain sight all along, disguised as inconsequential details, overlooked by all but the most observant. The pattern revealed the hand behind the events, deliberate, precise, and audacious. The crime was not a series of isolated acts, but a single, carefully executed plan designed to manipulate perception, delay discovery, and assert control over both the investigation and the household itself. The moment of revelation was approaching, and Poirot's little grey cells, now fully attuned to the rhythm and logic of the murderer's design, prepared to expose the orchestrator of this holiday tragedy around them. Poirot gathered the household in the drawing-room once more, his presence calm yet commanding. The firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the tension in the room. The previous day's chaos had left everyone on edge. 2 murders, vanished evidence, and a web of deception that had twisted suspicion in every direction. And yet, Poirot's mind was serene, his little grey cells working tirelessly to bring the hidden truth into sharp relief. He did not need theatrics, he needed clarity, and the moment for revelation had finally arrived. "Mes amis," he began, his voice measured, "we have spent these past days observing, questioning, and examining every detail. But there is one truth that has eluded us all, until now." His eyes swept the room, noting every micro-expression, every flicker of tension. This crime is not merely about greed, nor about petty jealousy, nor even revenge as we commonly understand it. The motive is far subtler, far more personal. A murmur ran through the room, but Poirot raised a hand, halting the chatter. It is a matter of pride, of perception, and of control over what one cannot bear to lose, respect, reputation, and the assurance of one's own significance. He turned to Mrs. Hawthorne first, noting the slight tightening of her lips and the narrowing of her eyes. "You, madame, feared more than the loss of wealth. You feared exposure, a revelation that would diminish your carefully curated position within this family. You believed, wrongly, that others would never forgive an indiscretion, a misstep from years past. And in your mind, Mr. Hawthorne, though a loving husband, though outwardly benevolent, represented the judgment that would undo you." Poirot paused, letting the words settle. The note beneath the tree, the careful arrangement of the body, these were not random gestures. They were symbols, deliberate message. Ease, intended to convey guilt, control, and secrecy. A crime orchestrated to communicate a deeper psychological truth. He then addressed Edward, whose face was pale but composed. "And you, Edward, were entangled in your own anxieties. The ledger, the ring, your partial confession, these were tools to distract, to mislead, to offer a convenient narrative that would shield the true architect from scrutiny. You were a pawn, yet not entirely innocent. You acted to protect your own fragile position, believing your actions clever. But cleverness, as you have seen, cannot outwit observation of human behavior." Edward's eyes shifted toward Sophie, whose own demeanor had grown taut with nervous energy. Poirot's gaze softened slightly as he regarded the young maid. "Sophie, your fear, your hesitation, your fleeting glances, these were signs of awareness, not complicity. Yet you sensed, on some instinctive level, the subtle manipulations of a mind driven by the desire for control. That is why your reactions were so telling. Because you were not guilty, your conscience betrayed nothing, only perception." Poirot stepped closer to the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back. "The true criminal, however, is one who believed that the past could dictate the present, that long-buried resentments could be manipulated to achieve a perfect tableau of influence and power. The murders were not impulsive, they were carefully planned acts of psychological domination. The crime was a statement, a demonstration of control over both the living and the memory of the dead. It was the fear of exposure, combined with a desperate assertion of dominance, that led to actions most extreme." He let the weight of his words settle in the room, noting the flickers of recognition, the subtle shifts in posture, the flashes of guilt. "The hidden motive," he continued, "is the assertion of identity. Of control of others' perception, the need to dominate not through force alone, but through fear, manipulation, and the orchestration of events that shape belief and understanding. Such a motive, though hidden, is as powerful as any tangible greed or desire for vengeance, and it is why the crime was executed with such meticulous attention to detail. Every object, every gesture, every note, every seemingly insignificant placement was a thread in a grand design. Poirot's eyes rested finally on the person whose subtle gestures had betrayed the underlying intent, the one who had orchestrated the sequence of murders, misdirection, and vanished evidence with precision. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. The mind that conceived this crime, Poirot said softly, was a mind seeking to impose order upon chaos, to control fear, perception, and consequence. And that, mes amis, is why this tragedy occurred beneath the Christmas tree, because the past, the present, and the future all converged in a need for dominion over what one could not bear to relinquish. The revelation hung heavy in the air, the room still, except for the faint sound of breathing and the winter wind pressing against the windows. The true motive was no longer obscured. It was a revelation of the psychology of the criminal, a window into a mind driven to extremes, willing to destroy lives and manipulate perception to satisfy a need deeper than mere material gain. Poirot's little grey cells had untangled the heart of the crime, exposing the shadowed impulses that had orchestrated the grim holiday tableau. Poirot moved quietly through the manor, his mind clear and focused. The household had been instructed to remain in their rooms under the pretense of continuing investigations, but Poirot had something more subtle in mind, a trap fashioned not of locks or bars, but of psychology, and observe it. Ion. Every detail of the morning had been carefully noted, the placement of objects, the traces of movement, the minor gestures and micro-expressions that betrayed the mind at work behind the murders. Today he intended to draw the criminal out, to confront the architect of this holiday tragedy with precision and calm. He began by gathering the household in the drawing-room once more, under the pretense of a final review of events. Poirot's eyes swept across the room, lingering on subtle cues, the tightening of hands, the flutter of eyelashes, the stiff posture of those attempting composure. He spoke softly, deliberately, recounting the chronology of events, emphasizing details as though casually narrating history rather than accusation. Each carefully chosen word was a lure, designed to unsettle the guilty mind while leaving the innocent unaffected. "Mes amis," he said, pacing slowly before the fire, "we have considered all the elements, the placement of objects, the sequence of events, and the reactions of those present. And yet, some details cannot be ignored, for they form a pattern too deliberate to be accidental." His gaze settled on Mrs. Hawthorne, whose slight tremor betrayed her nervousness, and on Edward, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Poirot allowed a pause, long enough for tension to fill the space, long enough for the guilty mind to feel the weight of observation. "I have studied the interactions, the behaviors, and even the smallest gestures that seemed inconsequential," Poirot continued. "The misdirection, the vanished evidence, the staged scene beneath the Christmas tree, they were not random. They were carefully orchestrated, designed to manipulate perception and conceal intent." Poirot's eyes locked on the suspect, whose subtle signals had been most revealing from the start, the individual who had moved the bell, manipulated the note, and orchestrated fear and confusion with meticulous care. And now, the time has come to confront the truth. A sudden flush appeared across the suspect's face, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of recognition. Poirot advanced a few steps, calm and unyielding, and allowed the silence to hang in the room, heavy and deliberate. The suspect's composure, carefully maintained for days, began to crack. A finger twitched, a breath caught, the mind racing for an escape, for some maneuver to divert attention. But Poirot had anticipated this. Every instinctive reaction, every attempt at deception had already been accounted for in his observations. "You have manipulated, deceived, and even killed, believing yourself clever and untouchable," Poirot said softly, his voice measured yet piercing. "But every step, every gesture, every tiny action has left its mark, and I have seen them all. The vanished note, the misplaced objects, the psychological ploys, they betray the mind that could orchestrate such a tragedy. And you, my dear friend, are that mind." The suspect rose abruptly, eyes wild with desperation, seeking a route of escape or a last-minute denial. Poirot remained perfectly composed, his calm a mirror to the chaos that had begun to surge. The household watched, silent and tense, as the guilty party attempted, ever so briefly, to regain control. The movements were frantic but calculated, a mixture of fear and instinct, Yet Poirot's anticipation was absolute. "You may try to run, to lie, to manipulate further," Poirot continued, unfazed, "but the pattern is clear. Your motives, your methods, your manipulations, all have been observed, analyzed, and understood. There is no room left for pretense. A final pause, pregnant with expectation, allowed the full weight of the detective's understanding to settle upon the suspect. The guilty mind, finally confronted by the unerring logic and insight of Poe. Poirot faltered, the intricate mask of control dissolving. With a trembling exhale, the suspect finally sank into a chair, resignation overtaking bravado. "It is true," they whispered, voice almost inaudible. "I did it. I could not bear the exposure, the shame, the fear of being diminished." The confession, hesitant yet complete, confirmed the detective's deductions. Poirot nodded slightly, the room releasing the tension that had gripped it for days. The trap had worked. The criminal's own psychology had been turned against them, revealing the motive, the method, and the mind behind the holiday murders. Poirot stepped back, serene and composed, as the household absorbed the truth. Justice had not required force or coercion, only the patient alignment of observation, deduction, and understanding of human nature. The peril was over, the criminal exposed, and the intricate pattern that had held the manor in suspense was finally laid bare. In the quiet aftermath, Poirot's little grey cells rested, satisfied, having once again illuminated the hidden threads of human cunning and restored order from chaos. The atmosphere in Hawthorne Manor was heavy with relief, yet Poirot remained seated in his chair near the fire, his hands clasped, his gaze thoughtful. The guilty party had confessed, the motive had been revealed, and the household slowly began to relax under the weight of closure. Mrs. Hawthorne and Sophie exchanged relieved glances, and even Edward allowed a faint, weary smile to cross his face. The second murder, the vanished evidence, the psychological games, all seemed to have been resolved with the careful precision of Poirot's deductions. And yet, the detective's mind was never fully at ease until every thread had been examined and every detail accounted for. It was while inspecting the drawing-room one last time that he noticed a subtle irregularity, a minute detail H.E. had previously overlooked. The bell that had been replaced beneath the sofa now seemed slightly askew, not in the casual way of a careless hand, but with a precision that suggested deliberate movement. Poirot crouched, examining the floorboards beneath it, noting a faint impression that was different from the scuff marks he had catalogued before. It was smaller, lighter, almost imperceptible to anyone untrained, yet to Poirot it spoke volumes. Someone had entered the room after the confession, after the apparent resolution, and had tampered with evidence, or at the very least attempted to. Poirot's mind raced through the implications. If the confessed murderer was truly alone in planning and execution, there would be no reason for further manipulation. Yet the traces suggested a secondary hand, someone who had observed from the shadows, waited and acted when all attention was elsewhere. He considered the household, reviewing interactions, micro-expressions, and subtle gestures that had initially seemed inconsequential. One figure now returned to the forefront of his attention, James, the butler, whose calm demeanor had masked an almost obsessive attentiveness throughout the investigation. He had always been present yet unobtrusive, watching and listening, moving objects almost imperceptibly as he carried out his duties. Poirot called the household together once again, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Mes amis," he began, "we have believed the matter resolved, that the confession provided the final piece. But as in many cases, one must always consider the possibility of a hidden mind, one operating in tandem or behind the apparent culprit, guiding events from obscurity." Eyes widened around the room, and even the confessed murderer stiffened, suddenly aware of the detective's unrelenting scrutiny. He moved deliberately toward James, observing his face, his posture, the faint tightening of his jaw. "You, James, have served this household faithfully for many years. You have witnessed every interaction, every subtle reaction, every concealed motive. You observed the initial misplacement of objects, the vanished note, and the psychological tests I conducted. And you, in your meticulousness, have sought to influence the outcomes, to ensure that your employer's reputation and your own understanding of order were preserved, even if it required discreet intervention in ways that went unnoticed by all but the most discerning observer. A tremor passed through James, a brief flash of fear crossing his composed features, though his voice remained steady. I only wish to protect the household, Monsieur Poirot. I did not harm anyone. I arranged things to guide suspicion, to prevent further calamity." Poirot's eyes, sharp and unwavering, studied him closely. "Ah, but you underestimated the mind of the detective and overestimated the subtlety required. Your actions, though intended to conceal and protect, left traces, small, imperceptible, but consistent with the pattern we have been tracing. You manipulated attention, you shifted objects, and you influenced perception, believing yourself the silent arbiter of truth." The household sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened in disbelief. Edward's jaw tightened, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she realized the full complexity of the web. Poirot allowed a moment for the revelation to settle. In truth, the final act of this drama was orchestrated not only by the confessed murderer, but guided in subtle ways by one who believed order could only be maintained through hidden influence. The genius of the criminal mind was matched by the subtle interference of one accustomed to observing, yet the full measure of control has been revealed today. James exhaled, shoulders sagging in reluctant acknowledgement. I see now, Monsieur Poirot. I thought I could manage the situation without your intervention, but I was wrong." Poirot nodded, serene, his little grey cells satisfied once more. The case, though appearing resolved, had contained one final twist, a hidden layer of manipulation, an unexpected guiding hand that had shaped events from the periphery. The true resolution was complete only now. The original murderer was revealed and accounted for. Yet the subtle influence of James, the observer in the shadows, was recognized, demonstrating that in human affairs, even the smallest hand can alter the course of events. The holiday tragedy had been untangled entirely, its final twist illuminating the depth and complexity of human cunning and the relentless precision of Hercule Poirot's insight. The quiet that settled over Hawthorne Manor after James's reluctant confession was fragile, almost deceptive. The household moved as though emerging from a fog, their relief tempered by lingering shock. Poirot remained near the hearth, calm and deliberate, his gaze sweeping across the room. Though the immediate danger had passed, and the confessions had clarified the murders, the detective knew that justice was not solely in admission. It required verification, evidence, and a careful alignment of facts that left no room for ambiguity. He motioned for Inspector Chalmers to examine the records, the objects, and the remaining traces of activity in each room. "Observe," Poirot said quietly, "the subtleties that were so easily overlooked. The pattern of misplacement, the vanished note, the smudges of ink and fingerprints. They all spoke long before the words of confession. The criminal believed their cleverness lay in deception and disappearance. Yet each act, however subtle, left a thread, and threads once traced reveal the entire fabric." Poirot walked slowly to the tree, pointing toward the delicate glass bell that had been manipulated multiple times. "Notice the deliberate misalignment," he said. "Small, almost inconsequential to most eyes, yet consistent with the pattern of movement and attention throughout the house. The bell's displacement was a psychological signal, not a mere accident. It indicated presence, intention, and control." He then moved toward the hearthrug, crouching to examine faint indentations left by careful steps. Here, one sees the precision of action, the retrieval and replacement of objects, the deliberate creation of distractions to guide attention away from the truth. Even in absence, presence leaves evidence. Chalmers observed silently, impressed but slightly bewildered. Poirot continued, allowing the household to follow each subtle point, connecting the vanished note, the staged positioning beneath the Christmas tree, and the second murder in the library. "Each act," Poirot said, "was part of a single cohesive plan, orchestrated with the understanding of human fear, attention, and expectation. One might believe that the confessed murderer alone executed it, yet our final twist revealed another hand, the observer who sought to manipulate perception and protect the household from scandal while hiding crucial truths. Both minds were revealed, their actions dissected by observation and reasoning." He turned now to the confessed murderer, whose shoulders sagged with the weight of exposure. "Your motive, a desperate need for control and fear of exposure, led you to extremes. Yet it is important, mes amis, to understand that cunning, no matter how intricate, cannot evade scrutiny forever. The clues, so subtle and overlooked by many, were always in plain sight for a mind attuned to detail. The misdirection, the vanished note, the precise placement of objects, they were signals to one who could read the language of intention, and now the story is clear. Poirot's eyes returned to James, whose quiet compliance had shaped the final outcome. And you, who believed yourself a silent guardian, influencing events to preserve order, have learned the same lesson. Human cunning can guide, can mislead, yet it cannot outpace the methodical observation of an investigator who considers motive, opportunity, and psychological nuance together. The household, though relieved, now absorbed the magnitude of what had occurred. Poirot's explanation illuminated the subtle missteps, the micro-expressions, and the evidence previously unnoticed. The faint trace of rosewood dust near the tree, the smudge of ink on a fingernail, the slight, involuntary glance toward a misaligned ornament. These were the hidden threads that allowed the detective to reconstruct the entire sequence and foresee even the manipulations of the secondary actor. As the final moments of the day unfolded, the authorities moved to secure the confessed murderer and ensure proper legal proceedings. Yet Poirot's mind lingered on the delicate complexity of the case. Justice had been served in terms of law, yet he knew that human cunning often leaves remnants, echoes of intention that cannot be fully contained. The household would recover, but the memory of deception, subtle and psychological, would linger in their minds like a shadow beneath the holiday cheer. Poirot finally leaned back, folding his hands calmly. "Mes amis," he said softly, "the lesson of this case is that human behavior leaves evidence even in the smallest gestures. The criminal believed themselves clever, yet they left behind a trail of subtle truth. It is in observing what others dismiss, the minutiae, the instinctive reactions, the minor shifts, that the detective triumphs. Justice has been delivered, yet the subtle remnants of manipulation remind us that in human affairs one can never fully close the book. It is always the little grey cells, attentive to detail, that remain one step ahead. As the household settled into a tentative calm, the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the manor in silent white. Poirot's eyes, sharp and ever observant, traced the familiar contours of the drawing-room one last time. The case was resolved, the perpetrators exposed, but the echoes of human cunning and the intricate dance of perception would linger long after, a reminder of the delicate balance between truth and deception. The sun had begun its slow descent over Hawthorne Manor, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted grounds. Poirot stepped lightly from the drawing-room, his overcoat draped neatly across his arm, his hat tilted just so. The household had begun to settle, the tension eased but not entirely dissolved. Though the criminals had been apprehended and justice, in its formal sense, delivered, Poirot's mind remained alert, tracing invisible threads that others would overlook. The case, in its full complexity, had been unravelled, yet the detective knew that in every resolution there remained the possibility of another subtle twist. Something more easily dismissed, yet rich with implication. He walked slowly along the hall, observing the minutiae of the rooms he passed, a chair slightly out of place, a letter tucked beneath the hearthrug, a faint smudge of dust near a window-pane. Each seemed trivial, but to Poirot such details were the pulse of a household's hidden rhythms. He paused, his gaze settling on a scrap of parchment he had not noticed before, partially tucked behind a stack of books in the library. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, precise, almost deliberate in its neatness. A cryptic symbol, perhaps a flourish rather than a letter, was scrawled at the corner. Poirot picked it up with gloved hands, feeling the texture of the paper, noting the faint scent of ink. It was not evidence directly connected to the murders, yet it stirred in him the same tingle of curiosity that always preceded discovery. The detective's thoughts turned to James, the butler, whose hidden influence had shaped much of the unfolding events. James's interventions had been subtle, psychological, and almost invisible to the casual observer. Poirot considered the possibility that such attentiveness might have extended beyond the immediate case, that the observant butler might have noted, recorded, or even manipulated details that lay outside the frame of the murders themselves. The scrap of paper could be unrelated, a coincidence, or it could be a message, a signal, or a warning. Poirot's instinct told him to remain cautious, for a detective's work is never truly done. As he stepped onto the manor's terrace, the cold air sharp against his face, Poirot let his gaze drift across the snow-laden grounds. The landscape was tranquil, almost serene, yet he felt the undercurrent of human complexity beneath the stillness. The past days had revealed greed, fear, and the desperate need for control. They had revealed subtle manipulations and carefully hidden intentions. Yet Poirot knew, as he always did, that human behavior is never entirely predictable. There is always a hidden motive, a secret action, a tiny detail waiting to emerge, one that can change everything. He allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. The case at Hawthorne Manor was ostensibly closed, but in truth, the manor would continue to hold whispers of its secrets. Objects slightly misplaced, glances exchanged too quickly, and small signs of human emotion that could lead to yet another revelation. Poirot's little grey cells thrived on such mysteries, on the faintest hints of human cunning. And so, even as the snow fell silently, blanketing the world in quiet white, he knew that another puzzle would arise, another human drama would demand his attention, and he would be ready. Poirot turned toward the waiting carriage, his movements unhurried, measured, yet purposeful. As he ascended the steps, he allowed his mind to linger once more on the scrap of parchment in his coat pocket. What did it mean? Who had left it? Was it a simple artifact of the household's rhythm, or was it a harbinger of another enigma, waiting for the precise moment to reveal itself? Poirot did not yet know, and that uncertainty, delicious and tantalizing, ensured that his mind remained ever alert, ever ready. The carriage rolled away from Hawthorne Manor, leaving the imposing house shrouded in the soft glow of twilight. Inside, Poirot's eyes were fixed, contemplative, and alive with curiosity. The murders had been solved, the motives uncovered, the confessions obtained, but the faint trace of mystery lingered. Perhaps it was the subtle smudge of ink, the misaligned bell, or the careful movements of a servant, some small fragment that hinted at untold stories beyond the immediate case. The world of human behavior, he knew, never truly rests, and the mind that observes, with patience and precision, can never claim finality. As the manor faded behind the snow-laden trees, Poirot allowed himself a quiet reflection. Justice had been served, yet the puzzle of human nature remained infinite. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the next mystery was waiting to unfold, and Poirot, ever vigilant, would be ready, his little grey cells poised to pierce the veil of deception once more. The case at Hawthorne Manor had ended, but the whisper of unanswered questions remained, a gentle promise that the adventure of the mind never truly ceases.